So the talk today, this afternoon, will be about the potters on the heath, all about the Heath Potter Wasp, one of my favourite insects. The talk will last about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, something like that. So there'll be time for some questions at the end if anyone has any. First of all, I'll give you another brief introduction to myself, and then I'll go into talking about how I've spent many years watching the Heath Potter Wasp, what I've learned about it, and what I've still yet to learn about it as well. So start with, I originally come from Hampshire. I grew up on Hayling Island in Hampshire, and I came down to the West Country to live in Cornwall originally at Falmouth School of Art, and then I've ended up living at Buttersley, just on the southern edge of Dartmoor. I've got a wide interest in natural history. I've been a member of the Society. I'm just working out actually for 45 years now. So I joined when I was about 14. So it's about a long association with the Society. I've also got a wide interest in natural history. So I'm very interested in insects, as you might imagine, but also any sort of natural history. So I'm out in the field as much as possible, watching things from long-tailed tits, as Ray mentioned, dancing adders, oil beetles, the horrid ground weaver, which is up in the right. I was working on that this week, and many other species as well. I'm a real field naturalist, so I like to get out in the field observing my subjects. So this is in all weathers. So I've been out most of the day today. This is out in Vienna, where our eldest son lives, watching a wall creeper in the cold last winter. So I draw and paint. I never draw out and paint anything indoors. I always draw outside on the spot, whatever the weather, as long as it's not pouring with rain. And that was drawing some wall creepers and long-tailed tits, which Ray mentioned, which are a favourite of mine. When I'm drawing in the field, I just use a basic kit, a few tubes of watercolour, some paper and some pencils. And the main thing is getting out there and observing the subjects and trying to capture the life and behaviour of the subject on paper. I use my illustrations in a variety of books. So done illustrations for Guide to Mini Beasts by Pete Smithers. Some of you may well know Pete, and also books on rockpool life and the wildlife of Dartmoor and many other subjects as well. I also write a little section in the Dartmoor magazine, and I'm given a free rein to write about whatever I like. So a recent one was all about creatures associated with dung. So that was, if you're interested in that, get hold of a copy of the Dartmoor magazine. But I'm, as well as drawing and painting, since the advent of modern digital cameras, I've got into digital photography and also video as well. These are the main cameras I use. So the top left is a Sony RX10 Mark IV bridge camera. I use that a lot for slow motion stuff, and it's a pretty nice camera to use. My general standard camera is the one to the right, which is a Canon SX70 with a little fluffy top on. That's to stop any wind noise. I always get asked about that. So it covers the microphone and stops you getting that horrible wind noise. And also use a little Olympus Tough. This is a TG7. This is the latest version of this camera, which is a really handy camera for taking pictures underwater and in any conditions, really. Done a lot of work for television, as Ray said. Most recently, I worked on Wild Isles, and I was involved at an early stage, so I get to get subjects that I like onto the telly. So the things I worked on and were my ideas originally were the Osmia bicolor nesting in the snail shell, the mating slugs, the ashback black slugs, and the starling roost on Bodmin Moor. So the Heath Potter Wasp, I first was aware of it really from this book, Solitary Wasps, which I'm sure many of you will have a copy of. And I was flicking through this book really before I was really into wasps seriously. I got a copy of this, and I saw this picture of a little wasp with what looked like a vase in amongst some vegetation, and it sort of intrigued me really. But I thought nothing more until many years later, in about 2010, I was contacted by Martin Dawn, who was making a series for CBBC about insects called Small Talk Diaries, and he wanted to try and film the Heath Potter Wasp. So I said, yeah, I'll give that a go. I've never seen one. but it looked an interesting job. So I said, yes, I'll have a go at that. And we ended up going to Dorset to look for it. So this is a national distribution of Heath Potter Wasp. As you can see, it's mainly found on the heathlands in southern England. So sort of Dorset, Hampshire, New Forest, and up into Surrey, and a little bit into Sussex as well. So down where I live, where the red dot is, it's actually right on the western edge of its range. So these are sort of typical sites. I did a bit of research on the wasp. So sites such as Chobham Common, classic heathland sites, Hartland Moor and in Dorset, New Forest, Hag Hill, and Stoke Common in Buckinghamshire, which is the most northerly site in the UK. And so I went out onto Stowborough Heath with Martin, and we soon found a Heath Potter wasp. There was one nectaring on a flower, and I was given some advice by Mike Edwards about finding the wasps, and he said, look for a little patch of clay and you'll find the wasps will be collecting balls of clay there, and they'll fly out onto the heath. But he said they're very difficult to find actually building their pots. They can go quite a way, and this was definitely the case. It was quite easy to find them, and we got some fantastic footage of the wasps collecting mud, but then they fly up across the heath and they disappear. I did find a few pots. I mean, we saw plenty of wasps, an amazing looking wasp. Very distinctive amongst all our British wasps because it has this bell-shaped first segment to the abdomen. Quite an interesting looking wasp. You can see it, just looking at it, you think it must do something interesting because it's just such an interesting shape and look about it. So we found them, and we found the pots as well. And I was amazed at the structures. These tiny little mud pots had been made by an insect. And I thought it must take them hours to make something like that, which isn't actually the case. I found out later. They're quite small. The macro photographs always make things look big. So there's a penny just to show the size of a potter wasp pot. So it's a bit the size of a large pea, really. There are other things which can be mistaken for them. This is a little spider cocoon called a groica, and this also, I don't know exactly how it does this. This is on my list to do, really, to find out how the spider coats its egg cocoon in mud. So we went down to Stowborough, as I said, and we spent 3 or 4 days. I was running around the heath trying to find the potter wasp building a pot, and I failed completely. But once I'd seen that pot, I really wanted to actually see a wasp build one. So I went back the following year and the following year after that, and again saw wasps collecting mud, but I still couldn't find any building. It just seemed almost impossible to do. Mike Edwards had said that when he found it, they'd found a few pots by forming a line of people across the heathland, and then as the wasp flew by with its ball of clay, they could follow it a little bit further until they found the pot. But we tried that and still failed. But I was determined to see it because it was looked such an amazing thing. Here's another couple of pots which I found, and I was just amazed by the beauty and the delicateness of these tiny little structures that I really wanted to see one being built. But it would take a few years. It took about 5 years in the end before I eventually saw a wasp building a pot. So I also found single pots and double pots as well. And I ended up coming a little bit closer to home. So this is a friend of mine found some pots on the East Devon Commons. This is at Bicton Common, just near Exmouth. And here they make red pots. And these were lovely red pots on the header. So I went to the site thinking, well, this is a bit closer. I didn't have to drive so far. I can go down to East Devon and have a look. And there was a really nice patch of open clay ground, which is what the wasps need, just by a boggy area. Because the wasp needs mainly in these heathland habitats, which it likes to live in, which are nice and warm. It needs some clay, high clay content soil, and a source of water. So this was ideal because in the foreground there's a bog with lots of water in it, obviously, and then some nice clay soil and plenty of heather and low gorse around as well. So again, I was watching the wasps collecting balls of clay there, and I thought, this is it. I should be able to find one here, but I failed miserably. There's another one collecting a ball of clay, and they would fly off. And this is from some lines that they take out from the quarry, and they would fly off in all directions. And I'd lose them almost immediately. They're almost impossible to track. Then I moved even closer to home. So this is Bovey Heath, which is literally just about 10 miles from where I live. And this is a really handy site. It's a site I thought I knew well. I'd spent a lot of time there looking at insects, but I'd never seen any potter wasps. I knew there were old records, but I presumed that they were it was an old relic population which had died out. But this wasn't be the case. The same friend, Pat Carter, who'd found the potter wasps in East Devon, found some pots here. So we started searching. This is a little brief history of Bubby Heath, and it's amazing that any of it survives. That was the heath in 1946, it's after the Second World War, and that's all that remains of it today. Most of it has been built on in the 1970s. It's a pity it didn't survive a little bit later. It would have probably been made into all of it would have been made into a nature reserve. But when I first knew it, it was really a dumping ground and motorbike scrambling area. It was owned privately, but it was open access. And you can see there back in 2003, you can see our two sons there. They're 28 and 24 now. So that was what it was like. There would be lots of motorbikes out scrambling and churning up the ground, creating quite good bear habitats, but quite a bit too much, really. And they were destroying the heath slowly. Then about 20 years ago, the Wildlife Trust, Devon Wildlife Trust, took over the site, and Stephen Carroll, some of you may know, was the site manager, and they basically restore the heathland across the site, and that's exactly that same view today. So it's the heath. It's a mixture of sort of heather and grass heath, very poor soils. This is in a china clay area, and the soil is very thin. So basically, this china clay is decomposed granite, which thousands of years ago was washed off Dartmoor, and so it produces this infertile land which the heathland has colonized, and so it's never really been farmed, and it's really quite a wild little spot, the tiny bit that remains, and it's incredibly rich in wildlife, if you're into tiny things, that is. So Pat and I found lots of pots out on the heath. It was looking really encouraging. We found plenty of pots, and eventually I found one which was open. It hadn't been sealed, which I'll talk about in a little while. And I sat and watched it for a while, thinking, I wonder what will happen. And a wasp flew in with a caterpillar and stuffed it in. So this is the very first time I'd seen a potter wasp actually active at its pot. And that was in 2010. Then I found another one nearby, and this one was also open. And I saw the wasp bring in some caterpillars. And then she brought in a small ball of clay and sealed the pot up. So this was exciting. So I was getting closer to seeing it actually build. So this is just finishing off. So she got some clay, and then she was just patched it up, and then she disappeared, leaving the sealed pot. I opened that one up, and inside were 38 caterpillars, mainly of pug moths, and a larva of the wasp. There's the wasp larva. Now, the books I'd read, because I'd done quite a bit of reading up, it said that there's between 7 and 9 caterpillars are put inside each pot. So this was immediately wrong. It was I'd found something. The very first one I'd opened, it got 38 inside. So as I discovered, a lot of the texts on the wasp don't always relate to the species, Eumenes coarctatus. Sometimes they're more general about potter wasps, but they've been repeated so many times because the wasp is so hard to study, because it is so hard to track. So, which I'd found, it's no wonder that there aren't many. I wonder why there aren't lots of pictures of these wasps around in books on heathlands and things. It's because they're so hard to actually find. But I was still determined to see one build, and this was the very first one I saw build in August 2010. And rather than flying miles out across the heath, it only went about 25 meters, and it flew from this little quarry, this little patch of clay, and there's Pat and friend Dave. And they sat at the quarry. They signalled when it was flying, and then I just waited on the about 25 meters away, and there the wasp came in, and that was a very memorable day to see the wasp actually come in and finish off her pot in this case in some gorse. So that was fabulous. So it was an ambition achieved, really. And he thought I may have stopped then, but actually that was just the start of things, really. So after seeing one build, and or partially build a pot, I really wanted to see more of this. So I spent many weeks and days out on the heath trying to track the wasps, and again with mixed success. It was very difficult to find them. if they flew any distance. If they were just going, because they can, what I found, go up to 120 meters away from the quarry. So if they go in any distance at all, they're very difficult to track. But this particular wasp, which I tracked here, and it tracked it about 40 meters away. And what I found on this occasion, it was just by chance that I was actually moving down a slope as I was tracking the wasps. So what I do is I see the wasp at the quarry in the foreground there, wait for her to collect a ball of clay, and then I see which way she flies off. And she always goes in a straight line to her pot. So I see as far as, I make a note of as far away as I definitely saw her. Then I put a marker on the gorse or header, and then I go and wait at that point, wait for her to come back to the quarry, then wait at that point and wait for her to fly over and try and get the line further and further out until you find the pot. So the key thing I learned was to get down low, really. So getting my head right down on the ground, lying down almost flat, so you could see the wasp against the sky. And that was critical. And that was a game changer, really, in terms of finding the pots. Because from that point on, I could see where the wasp went. I could mark that spot. But then I'd have to, must look very odd to people going over the heath, because I'd run out to the spot, lie down on the ground, and I'm sort of staring at the sky. And then this wasp flies across and I run after it and try and see how far I can follow it out onto the heath. But the reward is great, finding the pot and seeing the wasp actually building it. And she builds it a bit like a human potter would make a ring pot. So she builds little sections of it and slowly builds the pot up. And it's paper thin as well, the mud. So after doing that, I started to try and find as many as I could, but it was very, very difficult. And also record them. So record some of the behavior on my original camera, which is a little Sony camera, which I used to use. And it was great to watch them. They're fascinating insects. And I still marvel today. I've seen the wasp building pots many times, but it's always an incredible thing to actually sit and watch a wasp build a pot from scratch there out of little balls of mud. There she is, just finishing off her pot. And she has these big, this is one under the microscope, she's got big spatula-shaped jaws, which she uses to mold the clay very, very carefully and very, very precisely as well. It's amazing what's inside the brain of that wasp, as all the information that she needs to build a pot. Tracking wasps, and I've tracked successfully about 300 now over the years, but and quite a few of those I've done on my own, but it is much easier if you've got someone to help you. So someone at the quarry here in the foreground is friend Dave, and so they can tell you when the wasp is flying. So I might be 30 or 40 meters out along that line somewhere, waiting for the wasp to fly by, but I don't know when it's going to fly if I'm on my own. But if someone shouts the wasp flying, I know it's going to come over within the next 30 seconds. And if it doesn't, I've missed it and I have to go back to square one. And but if you do find it, and I've spent many times with friends tracking them, and also on my own, and tracking them up to 120 meters out across the heather, which is quite an achievement, and it certainly keeps you fit doing that. But I do get a chance to draw and paint them as well as photographing them. So this is some sketches I did of some this year. It was in middle of September. So the wasps were mainly active from very late May right through into September time, sometimes even October as well. They will keep flying as long as the conditions are warm and sunny. The wasps do need sunshine. They do need warm conditions to be active. So in that first year, I just found a few, but what I found is after finding the first, if I tracked a wasp to a pot, and then I watched the process there, and once she'd sealed the pot, then I knew that the wasp would then return to the quarry the next day or within the next few hours and build another one. So I could go back to the quarry and wait, and then build up a little picture of where that particular wasp went. So this is a very early map of tracking this same wasp to 4 different locations and watching her build there. So I did this quite late in the year, but it was fascinating to do. And once you got your eye into tracking them and also your eye on how to tell all the different wasps apart, because that was a bit tricky, it opened up a new world. Actually, you could see what individual wasps were doing. I also mapped all the pots which I found on the heath and also tracked their success rate. I did write this up for British Wildlife, which I'll give you a link to at the end of the talk. And during that case of that, during the course of the study for that, I found about 1,000 pots, or well over 1,000 pots actually, not all tracked, but just by looking out on the heath, and I monitored their success rate. What I found early on was that a lot of the pots were built in groups, and this always seemed to happen late in the year. So this always, and what I found now is this tends to occur in September and October. So if the wasps are still building, then they tend to group their pots together. And I think this is a labor-saving, time-saving device, because the wasp will be looking for new sites after each pot in the usual course of events. But if she seems to know she's running out of time, she will just put all her pots in one place. The pots look quite amazing when they're first built, with the beautiful fluted lips on them, but all this wears off in the winter. So that's the same set of pots at the end of the winter, where they've been washed down really, and they just look like balls of mud stuck to the heather. But they're very resistant to the weather. Not many of them fall off. And there's a red one. You can see it sort of molded into the stem of the heather there. And that red pot wasn't found on Bicton Common, but I brought a little bit of the red clay back to Bovey Heath, where I was doing my work, and just mainly to see a red pot being built. That was the main thing. I thought it'd be nice if I put a bit of red clay. Maybe a wasp will take this clay and make a red one. But what I found was actually the wasps really home in on this clay because of the quality of the clay. So on Bovey Heath, as I said, the clay is from decomposed granite, China clay, and it's quite gritty compared to this red Devon clay, which was from ancient riverbeds. So it's a much finer, silty clay with finer particles in it, and the wasps absolutely love it. So not only did I attract wasps to this red clay, but I attracted lots of wasps, because any wasp which found that clay would much prefer it to the local stuff. So this is a really interesting thing that you find just by chance. What it has enabled me to do is I've got a red quarry and a yellow quarry, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it enables me to, if I find a red pot, I know anywhere on the heath, I know exactly where it's come from, because there's no other red clay on the quarry. So it enabled me to track some pots, which otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do so. And there's a Potter Wasp coming in with a ball of red clay. She's building on gorse again here. So they will build on gorse and heather mainly, but occasionally they will use bristle bent grass and stiff grasses and build pots on those as well. But that's much, much rarer than gorse and heather. As I said, they need a source of water. So when the female wasps emerge, and after their mating, which I'll talk about in a minute, they need a source of water to build all their pots from, and they do use the same source each time, and they use a quarry. So I knew this fact, so what I did was set up a little quarry by a pool of water so that I could watch the water collecting as well as the clay collecting all in the same spot. And this is my yellow quarry. It's not always yellow now, it's got various colors on it, but originally it was a yellow color, and it's by a little pond, a tiny little pond, which used to rarely dry up, but it does quite a bit now. But it enables me to study all the behavior of the wasps around the heath. And this is where I've conducted most of my work, in this little patch. So this is 2014. And in 2014, I had about 14 or so wasps using the quarry in August time. So it was a busy place with wasps going backwards and forwards. I did have, at that point, I mainly had yellow clay, but I did put on some other colored clays to mark different quarries around the site. And one of the clays I used was this stuff called Bideford Black, which, and some of the Potter wasps use it to make little black pots. This was a friend of mine had found some at near Bideford in North Devon, and there was an old mine there from like the 1950s and 60s where they used to mine mascara before they had synthetic substitutes of mascara. There used to be a mascara mine. One of those little known facts, but it fits in, and it was quite nice to use some of that clay and see the wasps build a pot with it. So there's a pot overwintering. So I've seen some this morning out on Bovey Heath, and what happens is the larva inside will just spend the winter inside the pot, and she'll actually make a mesh web inside, a cocoon inside, which holds the whole structure together, so it can withstand really bad sort of wet conditions. So and I'll talk a little bit in detail about this in a little while, but all the pots which are overwintering, so anyone which you find at this time of year, will have a pre-pupal larva inside. So it's eaten all its food, its caterpillars, and once it's done that, it just sits there as a pre-pupal larva, and it won't pupate until the spring. So they will pupate in about April time, and then begin to emerge in late May. And when they emerge, they don't come out of the hole which the wasp put the caterpillars in. They can just break out the wall anywhere. So they just bite a hole through the wall and emerge that way. And the emergence is very quickly. It happens very quickly. I have kept a few at home, and it's very difficult to see them. It might be easier in future if you had a sensitive microphone and stuck that by some pots around the time they were going to emerge, because then you'd be able to hear the thing scratching away and digging. But once it gets to the stage where it's ready to remove the lid, it happens very quickly, and the wasp quickly emerges. That's a freshly emerged one, actually out on Bovey Heath. That's a male. And if you can see, if you look at his antennae closely, they're hooked at the end. I'll talk about that in a minute. And that's a typical emergence hole. So it's a reasonable size, and it's come out of the side of the pot there. But you do get other holes out of the side of the pot, and this is a much smaller one. And so this pot has been parasitized by a parasitoid. I have to thank Stephen Falk for identifying this. This is a Mobius signata, a little sarcophagid fly, which I think goes after all sorts of wasps, solitary wasps, which provision with caterpillars and other prey items like that, paralyzed insects. So this little fly, well, this is one hanging around, and I rarely see them actually. I've reared them from some pots, but actually seeing the flies around the heath is quite uncommon. So on this occasion, this is a potter wasp building a second pot, and one of these Immobia flies was hanging around. And I have occasionally seen them following the wasps, but they can obviously track down the pots, and they lay eggs in there at some stage, I presume, while the pot is still open, and then their larvae eat the contents of the pot. There's also, which I haven't seen on Bovey Heath, but this wasp called Acrorhypnus stylator. It's got a sort of mean-looking thing with a big ovipositor on it. I haven't found this on Bovey Heath, but I have seen it on the Dorset Heaths, coming out of pots there. So I think it probably needs a bigger population of the wasp to support a parasitoid like this, because I think the population on Bovey Heath is probably just too small. But in which case I've never ever seen it in Devon, only in Dorset, where there's obviously a much larger population spread over large areas of heathland, but not an isolated little scrap like we have in Devon. And there's another one which I thank Mark actually for identifying. This is a thing called Geelis, which is a tiny little wasp which uses, we think it may parasitize the spider, which I showed you earlier, but it likes case-bearing insects, I think, to parasitize. But I've found it 2 or 3 times in potter wasps as well, so it obviously gets into these sometimes as well. The wasps themselves feed on nectar, so they just need nectar to feed on. This is one feeding on some older buckthorn, which is one of their favourite nectar sources. And the females, and this is the only time I've ever seen this, so it's the only way I know this, is they will sometimes catch caterpillars and eat them. So obviously for egg production, they need some protein. So they will sometimes catch caterpillars and eat them. But I only know this from literally one observation. It would be very, very difficult to see. The males are quite tricky to see themselves. They fly early in the season, so as they're usually the first ones which emerge, as is often the case with bees and wasps. So the males will emerge and they'll patrol around flowers and the quarry, but they're quite tricky things to see. Sometimes I haven't seen one this year, for instance, but other years I see quite a few. This was a little fight between two males I saw once on the heath. The males have a yellow face compared to the females, which have a black face with small yellow spots. But they also, if you look carefully there, they have orange hooks on the end of their antennae, and these are, I don't know exactly what they're doing, but they tap the female's antennae during courtship and mating with those orange hooks. So it's obviously some sort of tactile, or maybe some sort of pheromone being passed over. I don't know, but it seems more likely a tactile thing, as they tap the antennae, and this is essential for mating to take place. And that's actual pair mating. You see at the bottom there, the female's sting is extruded during mating. So mating lasts for about 20 minutes up to an hour, sometimes depending on the temperature. And then after the females have mated, they will select a source of water, and I'm pretty sure it was impossible to prove, but I'm pretty sure they choose their source of water first, and then they will choose a quarry site. So this is an aerial of the heath. So the yellow quarry, my main study quarry, is in the middle in yellow, and the blue spots are where there are water sources. So the reason I think that they choose the water first and then find the clay is because at my yellow quarry, I mean, one year I marked 14 wasps, which I'll talk about in a short while, and some of them collected water in the little pond right by the quarry, but some of them didn't. Some of them flew all the way a few hundred meters to this big pond in the bottom of the center of the aerial picture there, and to collect water there. And others flew the opposite direction the other way, and others went other places as well. So I think what happens is they select a source of water, because that's usually the rarest thing to find. And on a heathland, often many heathlands have got very small amounts of water. So they find a source of water, and then they go off and find the clay. And then once they've got those sources, they use them for all their pots, except if the water dries up, which does happen sometimes. And I have had occasions where the pool by the top of the heath here has dried up, because I can see it coming into the heath. The pool's dried up, and then I suddenly get wasps turning up by my quarry at the little pool there, collecting water, and then flying off in that direction. And I have tracked one back to its quarry as well by doing that. So they are plastic to a certain degree in terms of choosing water sites. And I presume if you cover the quarry up with a big tarpaulin, they would go and find another quarry somewhere else. But obviously the quarry usually remains where it is. There's nothing likely to happen to it. So there's a female collecting a ball of clay, and it takes about 2 minutes. So she'll collect some water, which lasts usually for about 2 or 3 balls of clay. And then she will come to the quarry and then start biting away, spitting out some water, and then forming a ball of clay in her jaws and her front legs. And then she will fly out onto the heath. Now, they're a little bit vulnerable at this point, and predators will try and chase them, but I've never seen one being caught. They're pretty quick and very quick at slipping out of your net if you're trying to catch them when I've been trying to mark them. This green tiger beetle had a go a few times. It kept running and trying to chase the wasp, but there was no chance it would ever catch it. The wasp was far too quick to be caught by a beetle like that. A lizard, again, the same thing. This lizard kept running out and onto the quarry where the wasp was collecting clay, and the wasp would just hover above it and then just wait for it to go. So the wasps obviously know, and they can recognize certain shapes and patterns, maybe. I don't know. I did try this year. I got some plastic lizards and put them on the quarry. And the wasps, if they were collecting clay, they just would not come down if there was this lizard there for quite a while. They checked it out and buzzed it. And if it didn't move, then eventually they would go down to the quarry. But if it moved at all, and came towards them, then if I moved it a little bit, then they'd just hover over it and wait for it to go. Some do get caught though. This is obviously some of them must get eaten, but most of the ones I've marked will always are there, and they seem to be around as long as I expect them to be. This one was building a pot, and then it disappeared for a few hours, which is unusual. And when it came back, some bits of its legs were missing. So I think it must have been caught by maybe a lizard. It's the only thing I can think of really, that's grabbed it by the legs, and it's managed to pull free, minus some bits of its legs, but it still managed to finish its pot. So these are my record-breaking tracks, really. So this is how I know the wasps go up to 120 meters away from the quarry. So there's the yellow quarry and the red quarry, and that's just showing you two examples of pots which I've tracked about up to 120. But this year I was tracking them, and we found this one with a question mark on, because I never found the pot, and it actually built a series of pots in the same location, because I saw the wasp go there several times. But it was flying up to about 130, 40 meters away and building up there. But it was so far away. It was just, even with friends helping, we just could not find it. But I may be able to find it over the winter, because I know roughly where it is. And as the vegetation dies back, it's sometimes possible to find the pots. And if I find a set of 4 or 5 yellow pots in that location, then it's almost certainly going to be that one. So this is a series of photographs just showing you a pot being constructed. So each photograph just shows one ball of clay being added to the pot. So it's an amazing process to watch. And you can see the photographs are taken immediately after the wasp has left. So the clay is still wet, and you can see the sections which have just been built. So usually about 22 to 28 balls of clay are required to build a pot. And it usually takes, in optimum weather, it takes about 3 hours, which is far less than I thought. I thought it would take days when I first saw a pot, but actually the construction is remarkably quick. If they're fairly close to their water source and the pot isn't too far away from the quarry, they can, the record I've seen is, I think, in about 2.5 hours. But most of them take longer than that, usually because the weather isn't so good, and the weather can delay a pot being built by days. It could build half a pot, and then it could rain for 2 or 3 days, even longer sometimes. But then as soon as the sun comes out again, the wasp is back, and it just picks up where it left off. It has a quick check and then starts building the pot on from there. So as I said, that was a ball the wasp dropped. So I just put that little photo montage together, just showing that that's how many balls of clay it takes to make that pot. So it's amazing the efficient how they draw the clay out. So it's almost paper thin into this very strong structure, this urn-shaped structure. I did eventually find a red pot on Bicton Common, the quarry I showed you earlier, but not by tracking it. I was actually looking for this thing, a sundew plume moth. And when I put my bag down, I'm afraid the video won't work, but if you have a look on my YouTube channel, which I'll show you at the end of the talk, you can see this video. And this is I just put my bag down and I saw a wasp hovering around my bag. I hoped I hadn't put my bag on the wasp's pot, and luckily I hadn't. And then she came back in and finished off her pot, and I managed to get some video. But unfortunately, I don't think, oh, it does, it works now. Here we are. So here's the wasp flying in with a ball of clay. And then you can see how she's using her front legs and her spatula-like jaws, and also her palps are very important in part of the process, and just drawing the clay out using her legs. So it's rough on the outside, but smooth on the inside. And here's another one. This is a time lapse. Hopefully this will play, of a wasp building a pot. This is a double pot, but you can see how she builds little sections. And she's also got her antennae inside the pot. And there's that fly again. That was the same pot. So she uses her antennae inside to measure out the the proportions of the pot, and then incredible how they can do it, just build a pot like that. And you can see how quick drying the clay is there. She'd obviously gone off to get some water, so she was a bit longer then. And then the end bit, she's a bit like a sort of a 3D printer, sort of going round and round when she does the lip and the little funnel shaped lip for the top of the pot. Always makes me laugh when I see these. And she's got one more ball, making an extra big lip like that. And then that's the pot finished and ready to provision. So the next stage is laying an egg. So she'll finish the pot. She usually flies away for a few minutes, letting it dry, and then she'll come back and sit on the pot for about 2 minutes as she extrudes a short strand of silk, and then she will lay the egg on the end of that. This is one that broke by accident, so I got to see the egg inside. And it's quite large actually in proportion to the wasp's body size, and as you can see, the egg is suspended by a tiny little strand of silk, and this is so that when the caterpillars are put in to provision the larva, the egg isn't squashed down at the bottom, it's actually suspended above it. And when the tiny larva emerges, it just needs to hang down from its thread and then start feeding on the paralyzed caterpillars. So after laying the egg, then the wasp becomes a hunter, and she flies out onto the heath. Often she'll go to flowers, so this is going on to western gorse, which is flowering in September. And she will find pug moth caterpillars. This is a double-striped pug moth caterpillar, which I know because I've reared some of these caterpillars and see what they are. And so she seems to be able to sense them by smell, because she'll fly around the gorse or the heather, and then she'll suddenly home in on a flower, and then she will rip the caterpillar out from inside its hiding place, and then she will sting it several times along in each segment of the body. And then she will sometimes mash it a bit with her jaws, make sure it's not going to get away. So it's still alive as she is mashing it up with her jaws, just to make sure it's not going to be mobile, but it is still alive and fresh for her larva. And then she ferries it back to the pot. So she'll go back, stuff it into the pot, and then go back and find another caterpillar. So she finds various size caterpillars. This is a tiny, I think it must be a little Tortrix moth caterpillar. It's one of the smallest ones I've seen a wasp come in with. But other times they can bring in big caterpillars. This is a horse chestnut moth caterpillar, and it's just right for the potter wasp. So she will only need about 7 to 9 of these, because they're very long and thin. The entrance to the pot is quite narrow presumed to stop parasitoids getting into the pot too easily. So there's a very narrow entrance, but it's just the right width to enable her to put in pug moth caterpillars. And if it's a big long looper caterpillar like this horse chestnut moth, that's perfect, because that will just go through in the hole. It takes a bit of effort to stuff it in, and sometimes they do bring in caterpillars which are just too big and they won't go in. It's quite rare. They usually judge them pretty well, but this one spent about 20 minutes trying to push this caterpillar into the hole before just abandoning it, because there was just no way it was going to fit in. And then when the pot's full, the wasp will check inside. If there's a delay, because the provisioning can take several days, and again it can be delayed by rain, so the wasp will always check inside the pot to make sure there's a viable larva or egg inside before she puts any more caterpillars in. And then she will check inside to make sure it's full, and once it's full, she will go back to the water source, collect some water, and then go to the quarry and collect a small ball of clay and then seal it up. And then sometimes she occasionally collects another ball of clay, but she'll check all the outside of the pot for any cracks and then sort of polyfiller those in. And there's the freshly sealed pot. You can just see the clay is still wet. Now, as I said, I marked some of the wasps, and I did this by catching them in a net. I mean, these days I tend to just mark them straight in the net, but at this point I had a little device with a net over it, so I can just catch the wasp, just hold it for a few seconds, and then use some Uniposca pens, which are designed for drawing on ceramics, and mark the wasp with those. So I ended up having different coloured wasps. This is the blue wasp. I'd have the red wasp, the red-green wasp, all sorts of different coloured wasps. But it makes it amazingly fascinating once you've got all these different wasps of different colours, so you know exactly which wasp it is coming into your quarry like sort of traffic control really at the quarry. You can see an incoming wasp and you know where it's going, or maybe you don't know where that particular wasp is going, so you need to track it. So I had about 14 of these on the go in 2014 when I spent a large amount of time late summer studying them, which is when I made these maps. So this was the record-breaking one. I found 22 pots built by this wasp, and I think they probably build between 22 and 24, 25 as a maximum during their lifetime, which is usually about 2 or 3 months. And these are some other examples from that same year. So it was interesting to see where some of the wasps went. Some of them didn't seem to like certain areas of the heath. They all went one way, and then others went sort of various ways, but not too far. And then others really didn't go very far at all, but in a variety of different directions. And then same with this one, and then another one. And then others would go quite a long distance. So it was fascinating, really. And I studied those wasps, and they kept flying because it was a late summer that year, a sort of Indian summer, and they kept going into the middle of October. So by the end, I've been studying them for weeks. And rather than becoming dull, watching them every day, it became more and more interesting each day as each day went on, and you built up a picture of the lives of what these wasps were doing. I don't think I'll ever do it again because it was such an enormous amount of work. And I was lucky I had some free time that late summer to do it, because as you can imagine, it takes absolutely hundreds and hundreds of hours. I do remember, I think I went there for about 9 days in a row because the weather was perfect. And I was there from 10 till 5 every day chasing wasps. But I learned so much in that period of time. But one of the interesting things, as I said earlier, as late in the season, as this was taking place in September, October, the wasps will build multiple pots, cutting out the searching time. So when they usually build a pot, they will come in to the quarry, they will sit on the quarry, go to the water supply, check that that's still there. Then they will go out onto the heath searching for places to build the pot. Then they will come back. And that can take a few hours, but it seems that late in the season they stop doing that, and they will just build a series of pots together. And in that year when I was watching them, and it just happened that it was a late year because when they went on to the middle of October, I had 2 wasps which built 8 pots together, which I think is a record. Certainly I've never known anyone else who's found 8 pots together. And the last one wasn't sealed, but she built and sealed 7 pots and provisioned them all as well. But they're all in the same spot. So that's quite an amazing thing to see. So from what I gathered, the information, I knew they go up to about 120 meters. So I can sort of look at each quarry and just say that's the area of the heath which is used by those wasps. Whether they go further than that, I don't know, but maybe they have a map of a certain area of the heath. And what I have noticed is that early in the season, the wasps will often build pots quite close to the quarry, and then as they build up a bigger picture of the heathland, they tend to go further and further out. But then they may return and come build a pot very close to the quarry again as well. So they always keep you on your toes trying to track them. I've been to some other sites. This is in Iping Common in West Sussex, and this is it's another site for potter wasps. I heard they were there, and I found them collecting clay on this little patch of clay and some trees. But here they were, as soon as they left the quarry, they were flying over or through trees, so they were impossible to track. So I think I'm lucky with Bubby Heath and actually having a site where I can easily track the wasps, because at other sites I've been to, they are very, very difficult to track. I have managed to track them in Dorset at Stowborough Heath, where I first went, but most sites I've been to, they are quite tricky. So that was a pot from Sussex, and this was some filming actually. So as well as doing all this, I've been obviously working with television crews. I've been asked for ideas, and one of the ideas I came up with for Wild Britain, which is a Channel 5 series a few years ago now, was filming the Heath Potter Wasp. We only had a day to do it, so it was one of those things that I went and found them a pot, and we got some film of that. And then we waited for the wasp to come back, and I said, it will probably build another pot now. It will start searching. We won't see it, but it will build one soon. And an amazing thing happened. This is the only time I've ever seen this. This is the like holy grail of potter wasp watching, is that the wasp came into the quarry, started searching for a new site, and then it just went onto some gorse a few meters away and started cleaning this little patch of gorse. And then we watched and filmed the whole process from nothing to a pot being built. So that's the first ball of clay there. And then the wasp came in and built the pot. And if you have a look on YouTube and type in Wild Britain 2020 potter wasps, you'll see that little sequence, which is unique. I'd be very surprised if anyone could ever film that again. That was a real total fluke, really, to get that. And the cameraman I was working with, I know quite well now, but I was freaking out. He must have thought I was nuts, because I was like, wow, this is a totally amazing thing to see. I've also published some of the work, as I said, in British Wildlife magazine. So if you want to check that out, that's in December 2015, of a little article illustrated with photographs and illustrations on the Heath Potter Wasp. And this was Cambridge Botanical Gardens. And Rosie Bleat, who some of you may know, had been told about some potter wasps which were found in the Botanical Gardens at Cambridge. And so I went up there with her to have a look for some. I didn't actually find the wasps that day, but Rosie had some of the pots which had been built, and some of what she'd hatched some of the wasps out as well. And these were them. They were built on some lavender. And I thought it must be a different species, because occasionally other species do turn up in the UK. Eumenes papillarius is one, and has another one been seen as well. But these are likely to be imports, because the pots could be imported on plants. But these have turned up, and they're obviously breeding in Cambridge. So it was interesting to see what they would be. They were very, very different to the pots that I find on Bovey Heath. But they were actually identified as the same species in the end. So it's another mystery, really, because I wonder if our species is maybe a subspecies, or the whole Eumenes coarctatus it's quite a very widespread species across the world. It's probably the most widespread of the true potter wasps. So maybe it's a species complex. You don't know really. I mean, it's a hard enough thing to study anyway. But I wonder if maybe what we're dealing with is at least a subspecies in this country, or maybe a different species altogether. So there's still a lot to learn. I did that extensive work in 2014, but I still always go and watch potter wasps each year. So there's always something new to learn about them. This year, I found this pot, which was built. The wasp had obviously changed quarry. So maybe it had found the red quarry after building a grey pot, because she built a grey pot from the local clay. And then maybe she was searching around and just happened to come across the red clay that I put out. And so she built her other pots with that. So that was interesting, that a pot that the wasp had changed quarry. It's not often you get to prove that, but that was definitely the case. And this is another nice one, which is, I think I showed you a picture of earlier. Late September is a really good time to watch these, because other insects' life is dying down. But the potter wasps, what happens is they emerge, as I said, end of May, early June. And the wasps will build a series of pots. They'll build 25 or 24, 25 pots, and then they would die. So if the summer is bad, then those wasps would survive right through till September before they built their pots. But if the weather's really good in June, then the wasps will then lay all their eggs by, sometimes mid-July. And so they will die. And what I found is that any pots which are built before the end of the first week of July always emerge in the same year. So you'll get a second brood of wasps, or a partial second brood of wasps. And these wasps will then fly right through into, as I said, mid-October. So there's usually always some second brood wasps, and particularly in the last few years, there's always second brood wasps. So September time, and the light's really nice then, is a really good time to watch these wasps. And also it's not quite so hot, so it is actually slightly easier to track them, but by no means it's by no means an easy thing to do. Some of the strange places, you think they take a lot of care in choosing the sites, but this is a pot just built on a bit of loose heather, which is blown around by the path. And this one, I'd love to have seen the wasp build this, because it's actually just stuck onto some sides of some cross-leaved heath. That's from earlier on. And this is some pots which I found in the September time. I think we were filming them this year, and we found Track This pot, which was then she added 3 more pots to. And I was out on the heath this morning, because the beauty about these wasps is that you can study them any day of the year, because you can always find their pots. So you could go and see where they're building, what sort of habitats they're building, and find out something about them. So that was the set when they were almost finished, and that was them this morning. I was out on the heath and it was frosty, and they're the pots with presumably with the pre-pupal larvae inside, ready to emerge next year. Okay, that's the end of the talk. If you'd like any more information, have a look on my website, johnwalters.co.uk. There's some links to lots of other YouTube clips on there. I've got 2 YouTube channels, but check out both of those. There's lots of potter wasps and lots of other stuff. And that's some examples of my videos which are on there. And there's also some wildlife research pages if you look under research, and there's a whole page all about the potter wasp with links. And I'm on Instagram and I'm on Twitter. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's absolutely brilliant. What a fantastic insect that wasp is. Absolutely amazing. And what a brilliant piece of observation and photography work. It's fantastic. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I don't think anybody's been typing questions. It's probably all been engrossed in listening to you during the talk. But if there are people who would like to ask questions, please do either wave your hand or shout out or whatever you'd like to do. Whilst you're thinking about that, I was intrigued. It reminded me actually of a collection we have in the Bristol Museum of weaver birds' nests, where a chap called Dr. John Crook went out in the field and he cut bits of the weaver birds' nests off as they were making them to see whether the bird recognised whether it had actually lost a bit. Could it cope with it? Is that something that's been done with the pots here as well, or not? Or
well, no, I've thought of that, but if the wasp's pot is damaged in any part of the process, a building, then it would just abandon it.
Right.
When I'm tracking them, I have on a couple of occasions I've been a bit too good at tracking them, and I've actually trodden on the thing, and then you get the wasp comes in, flies around its broken pot, and then it just goes off and builds another one. So yeah, if there's anything happens to the pot, it will, and during the provisioning stage as well, if there's any cracks or whatever appearing, something's damaged, then the wasp immediately senses that and just switch modes and goes into searching for a new site and builds a new pot.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Brilliant. Has anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask John while you got the chance?
Yeah, regarding tracking these things.
Yes.
I remember seeing a program on the telly a few years ago. There was native Amazon Indians were tracking honeybees to find the nests, and they were tying little white feathers to them so they could actually see them fly through the trees.
Yeah.
Obviously, honeybees are a bigger insect than these things, but I just wondered whether that might be possible to actually see them in flight.
Yeah, I mean, when in my 5 years of searching, things like that did cross my mind. But these wasps are so small.
Yeah,
you can't. They're so delicate. If you tied anything to them, that would just stop them dead, really. So yeah, they're just too small to do that. And also, radio tracking them would be good, but they're just that tiny bit too small for any technology that's available at the moment to put a little tracker on. So I had to really just be persistent and track them myself, but it did take a long time. But as you say, yeah, I saw those same things, and with hornets as well, where people had found hornet nests by tying bits of string and wool to them and things like that. It did cross my mind, but it just would be impossible with these wasps, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have radio trackers now that will go on honeybees.
Yes, yeah. So I've seen those, but even those, these wasps are tiny, really, compared to a honeybee, and also they're not as robust as a honeybee. I mean, honeybees are designed to have a reasonably short life, collecting and being out and about. These things are much more delicate and fine tune to what they're doing. So I think if you stuck anything on them, they would just die. They wouldn't be able to function properly at the moment with the technology that's available at the minute anyway. Maybe in the future there will be some tiny little transmitters. That would be brilliant. I mean, I'd love to see where the wasps go and what they do all the time, track some wasps and actually see where they are, where they roost, that sort of thing. But at the moment, that's just, well, it's impossible unless you actually just go and try and find them, which again is not an easy thing to do.
As well as some very complimentary comments in the chat, there's a comment from Stephanie. How many ambulances got called when bystanders spotted you sprinting across a heath before laying flat on the ground? I mean, it struck me as well that actually someone ought to film that activity, because it's just as exciting as watching the insects, probably, to see the actual event.
Well, it has actually been filmed. I can't, I mean, there's a little YouTube, if you look in my YouTube things, because people ask me how you track them, there is one of me tracking a wasp which shows you how to do it. But it was filmed professionally this year. I can't say too much more about it, but it will be available on social media, I think, when the particular program goes out, I think in 2024. So look out for that, because they made some really nice, got some really nice shots. I actually made a little film about how you track the potter wasp, because as you say, yeah, it's the potter wasp tracker. I can see myself out there and you're thinking, oh, you must look nuts. And I mean, sometimes, I mean, luckily there aren't too many people out in the heath, but I remember one occasion when there was someone walking their dog, and occasionally if the wasps are flying into the wind, I can actually keep up with them and run after them. So I ran after this wasp and I run right across the path of this person and gave him a shot when I'm leaping out. Or just lying, they think, you know, what, is he all right, that guy? And he's lying there. And then he suddenly gets up and runs across and then lies down again. So yeah, it must look very odd, but it's all part of being eccentric and being a potter wasp spotter.
There was a serious question from Stephanie as well, which was, do you have any tips for capturing such speedy, flighty subjects in sketches?
In sketches, well, it's all about practice, really. I mean, I've been drawing and painting since I was small, and it's about working in the field, and working quickly, which it's harder than it actually looks when you see hopefully when you see the sketches, they look like they're done quickly and fast and they capture the thing, but they do actually take a long time to do. They can take a few hours to get those drawings. It's all about looking. It's mainly about observation and practice in terms of trying to draw them. There is a little video somewhere on my YouTube of me painting, a little time lapse of showing how I paint. If you have a look through those, there's a couple actually, one of some long-tailed tits and one of some bees. Or you can just email me and I'll send you a link to those if that will help.
And Andrew's put in the comments there, presumably only parasites inside the prey will get eaten. Presumably that means parasitoids in the larvae.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I forgot to mention that. Sometimes I do open up pots and I find tiny little wasps in there which have emerged from the caterpillars before they've been eaten. But once they're in there, they're not going to be able to get out. So it's only the parasitoids which are designed to exit the pot that can escape. But any other little parasitoids which are in those pug moth caterpillars are going to hatch, and then they're just doomed. They're just stuck inside the pot.
Lovely. Are there any more questions? I don't think there's any more on the chat at the moment. Anybody else who'd like to jump in? Oh, there's a new question from Sue, which is, could you add something fluorescent in UV in the mud and hunt at night for the pots?
Yeah, well, I have thought of that as well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I don't know how you do things like that, but it is possible that, yeah, you could do that and then go out with a UV torch and find them that way. I quite like the challenge of, I mean, there's all these sort of ways of doing things, but I got to the point from having never seen a pot that I can't actually not see them now. They're quite hard to see in amongst the heather. But I remember one occasion I was late and I had to sort of run back to the car to get home, but I still somehow saw this potter wasp pot in amongst some heather as I was walking by, and so I had to stop and mark it. It's one of those things that once things get into your subconscious, your brain just searches for them and you see them without really thinking about it. But yeah, certainly there would be other ways of doing it, but I quite like the challenge. Really, it's the hunter-gatherer in me really that comes out in terms of developing the field skills, the physical skills as well, running around on the heath when it's very hot sometimes. It's quite demanding, and but it's very, very satisfying because it is quite hard work doing all that. It's even more satisfying when you find the wasp, and then you get the reward of photographing it or drawing it, and showing it to other people as well. Because because there's not many other people who can find Potter wasp pots. There's a couple of other younger people, people who can now track them a little bit. When I've tracked hundreds, but it's otherwise people would never have the opportunity to see them, because as you said, it took me 5 years, and I know how hard it is. But I can track them and invite people along, and they can sit and watch them as well. So it's nice to share that activity and share the behaviour of these amazing wasps.
Another good question that's popped up as well: how does the parasitic fly get out of the pot?
I did show you a picture of that. There was a little hole, which I showed you after the emergence hole. So it was a small hole. So I presume, as flies do, they blow up their head as when they escape from their cocoon, their pupa case, the usual case. They actually have an inflatable head, and so they must use a system like that. I've never seen it happen, but they can burst through the mud wall, because obviously they're designed to do that.
And as a very temperature dependent species, do you think climate change is going to mean it's going to expand its range, or is the lack of habitat going to be a problem?
Yeah, it's probably a lack of habitat. Although abroad, it lives in all sorts of habitats, so potentially it could occur in different habitats. And those ones, like the ones in Cambridge, were found in the botanical garden, and they weren't necessarily from the botanical garden. They could be around in other areas in Cambridge in gardens. But so potentially, yes, it could spread. But I think our one is very much confined to heathlands. It is, as I said, it's almost like a subspecies, really, that living on the edge of its range, and it is very tied to these patches of flower-rich heathland where there's a lot of heather and gorse. And I think it really needs those flowers with a rich supply of pug moth caterpillars really to survive, as well as the warm conditions and the right clay and water supplies as well.
Brilliant. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to end the questions there. Thank you again, John, for that fantastic talk. Absolutely wonderful.